Hi, everyone. Welcome back to Misconceptions. I am thrilled to introduce to you a colleague and friend. I really feel very lucky. I feel like I have these people like kind of cross into my life in different times and places. And I've had this wonderful opportunity to meet a newer colleague and friend, I guess you could say, only within the last 10 years. Welcome, Carly Chadash. Thanks for saying yes to being on the podcast.
Yeah, I love doing podcast recordings and I love doing them with you. So thank you. Thank you for having
Absolutely. So, our conversation today is going to be a tough one. And I would just preempt this conversation with for those of you who've had a history of child sexual abuse, this is a conversation about child sexual abuse from a therapeutic lens, from the perspective of what it means to be a survivor of that experience. Some of you may know this, some of you may not, but I run a child sexual abuse prevention program here in the Philadelphia area. I've been doing that now for 10 years, actually, which is amazing. It's a part of Jewish Family and Children's Services. And when I was working with them kind of on a macro level, and then left to go into private practice, I am so thankful that they said, yes, we are committed to this program and we will continue to sustain this program. And they have done so for the last 5 years as well. So this the program is called Safety Kid. It's a product of Magen Yiladim International. And this is a program that we go into every single Jewish day school in Philadelphia to teach about prevention. And obviously, the best part of the work is teaching parents and educators about creating a safe environment. And so, as an outgrowth of that, I've had this other hat that I wear beyond my maternal and reproductive mental health, and you will see this show up in our podcast conversations. And I think what also happens, and I know Carly, you will speak to this as well, when you become known as someone who can hear these stories, you end up hearing these stories a lot. I've had the privilege of hearing people because I've asked them to share their stories with me and have used some of that information when I teach our students, and it gives it so much more of a robust, more meaning, more quality in the education we do. So that's why this conversation is so important to me. And I would love for you, Carly, to tell the audience a little bit about who you are, what you do. And folks, get ready. If you think I wear a lot of hats, wait till you hear what Carly does. Carly, tell us a little bit about yourself.
okay, so I am Carly Chadash. I'm a licensed clinical social worker, a certified sex therapist, and a perinatal mental health counselor, just like Dvora. So we have a lot of the same letters after our names, which is really a humongous privilege to share those credentials. We're the only two Orthodox Jewish dual certified perinatal mental health therapists and certified sex therapists, which is very exciting. And I also am our local mikveh director. And I also do some clinical supervision for other social workers in the Philadelphia area as well. And so my intersection and the trauma-informed lens that I take, that I have had the privilege also to hear a lot of these stories from survivors, actually started as an outshoot of my role as mikveh director in understanding the experience. So the mikveh is the ritual bath that
Thank you.
Orthodox Jewish women immerse in based on their own individual schedule that is based around their monthly cycle. And part of the process involves both an inspection of one's own body as well as being in the presence of another individual while they are going through that immersion process. And when I started as the mikveh director, one of the primary lenses and goals that I had for our local mikveh was to create a trauma-informed space where women could come without being afraid of being scrutinized or feeling like they were being watched or observed, which is particularly triggering for anybody who's going through any sort of medical intervention, whether it's a fertility intervention, which I have some personal experience with, or someone who is a child sexual abuse survivor in particular. And so that was kind of where my interest in understanding the experience of a survivor came from, is from being able to do better as a community to support survivors. And then in my mental health training, which kind of happened concurrently while I took on this role as mikveh director, being able to really work with survivors, especially from a sexual therapy perspective, and being able to support relationships of healing and trust and being able to navigate whatever that individual road looks like for people who have experienced childhood sexual abuse or not childhood sexual abuse, but sexual abuse in general.
Yeah. One of the things I think is fascinating and why you and I have been having these conversations, we actually gave a presentation last year at Postpartum Support International's conference together. I think both of us felt in our sex therapy training, there was almost zero conversations about treatment of the sexual abuse survivor. And it felt like this tremendous, kind of vacuum of we know that unfortunately abuse happens at a very high rate for women in particular. Our numbers are all over the place, but most likely 1 in 3 women to 1 in 8 women are sexually abused. And so when we know that, and then we're talking about, we don't know the data relating to a religious Jewish community, and so what we have heard from our own internal experts is that absolutely we have a prevalence of this issue just like in any broader non-religious community, and yet the what we can also assume is that for people who are abuse survivors, the likelihood of a few things happen. One is that it's likely that the abuse may go on for a longer period of time, and two, it's likely that they may not get the support that they need if they do disclose over time. And so that tends to be the trend in other kind of very insular religious groupings, and so we have no reason to believe we are different. I think we've made a lot of inroads, but what you're highlighting is that the environment of the religious environment, for example, of the mikvah. For those of you who aren't familiar, please like Google it, and hopefully you'll find some good quality information on it. You've heard it referenced multiple times in previous podcasts, but for those women going through that environment, talk to me a little bit more. And I want to be very clear that no one is inspecting the body of the woman before she goes into the mikvah, to the water. And why that's incredibly important is I think there's sometimes a misunderstanding about that the woman who is accompanying her or there as an attendant is doing an inspection. And the answer is that she really is not supposed to be doing an inspection. There are environments that there may be some like, would you like me to check your fingernails to see if there's something hanging off your nail that I can help you with? Would you like me to take a look at your back to make sure there's no hairs that are just straggling on your back? But there is no requirement or like really structure for inspection. And yet that seems to be part of the misunderstanding. So putting that to the side, let's discuss a little bit. What is it about that mikvah environment where there is that self-inspection that women who are survivors of sexual abuse really struggle with?
So I think that in order to answer that question, it's really important to understand the lived experience of a survivor and the relationship that a survivor has with their own body, which so there's a dissociation, and it's not a cognitive dissociation that happens, although that is usually present as well around anything that is a reminder, a post-traumatic reminder of the sexual abuse experience. But a lot of times there's a distrust of one's own body that occurs as a result of surviving childhood sexual abuse. And if we think about it from a strengths-based perspective, it was absolutely necessary for survival for this individual to learn the skill of being able to disconnect from their body while they were going through this sexually abusive experience and this traumatic experience, which was happening to their body, in their body, and may have also involved bodily responses that were incongruent with the emotional reaction that they were having at the same time. So, I'll see this sometimes with male survivors where they'll have an erection or they'll have an ejaculation while they're experiencing abuse, and they'll think that that means that they enjoyed the abuse experience cognitively, but really they were completely disconnected. If you're feeling like you're watching your body from outside of yourself and that you're seeing this happen from a third person perspective, that's depersonalization. That's not being integrated and present during a sexual experience. And so part of the mikveh experience requires having a comfortability with being present in your own body and then doing a full body ritual in order to mark a transition from one spiritual status to another spiritual status.
Well,
And I'm go ahead.
what is it about the word distrust? I understand it from the male perspective, right? I get it. I think it's pretty obvious that the body has almost like betrayed him by having this sexual or physical response. What is it about the woman's experience in this space? And we'll come back to this mikvah piece of it because I think it's powerful, but I want to get to that nitty gritty of why the word distrust, that the woman does not trust her body. I wouldn't trust other people's bodies, but what is it about me not being able to trust my own in that experience?
So I think that the majority of survivors, this is my anecdotal evidence, and I'll be honest, I haven't looked at to see if the empiric evidence agrees with me, but the majority of survivors that I've worked with experience a freeze response to trauma when they
Okay.
go through childhood sexual abuse, which means so it's either freeze or fawn. So freeze is a freeze response. They froze. They didn't get up. They didn't scream. They didn't run away. They didn't, and so they internalize a lot of responsibility. Like, did I consent because I didn't X, Y, and Z? We know from like a structural societal standpoint that used to be a prerequisite to being able to persecute a rapist was did the woman scream loud enough that others would be able to hear her, which is outrageous. It's an
Sure.
outrageous recommendation. And that existed until I think the 90s. It
Mm,
wasn't something that was, it's not something that has been widely recognized as like we have created a lot of structural harm as a society around the idea of what an abuse experience looks like. Or there's the fawn response, which is the people pleasing response, which is, if you're in a dissociative state, can you consent? No, of course you can't. It's impossible to consent. And that's where the murkiness of memory comes in for a lot of survivors, is that they don't remember participating in the sexual experience, but they think that they might have. And so what is that? Was that experience consensual? No, it was not. If you were dissociated or if you had that feeling of floating over your body, and also female survivors do sometimes also have a sexual response. Their
sure.
bodies become aroused. They may self-lubricate or may even have an orgasm. That does not mean that they didn't that they consented. It doesn't mean that they
Right.
wanted this experience to happen.
So what you're saying, I hear you saying that the word distrust is that I cannot trust that my body will have an appropriate, um, you use the word integrated. I want to make it a little bit more simple, but like an appropriate response to the experience that I'm having in front of me, so that I don't know that my body will not freeze up, or that my body will not, or I won't dissociate, or I won't depersonalize my, like, the in the moment of this, whatever this is. And therefore I cannot trust that my body will have like an accurate reaction to any event that's coming my way. Is that how you see this playing out over time?
So I would question I would say that yes, for the belief, but I would say that if we're going to be looking at this from a purely survival perspective, that whatever the survivor experienced in that moment was the appropriate response for that individual's survival, that there was something that they were going through, right? And they didn't have the capacity or the wherewithal or to get up and do what they would have done had they felt in control. But because they weren't in control, like it's not their fault. It's not that it was an inappropriate response. It's that it was a necessary response for survival. The same way that, an animal in the forest will play dead around a predator, right? Is
Right.
that the appropriate response? There's no way to know. Sometimes the predator still kills the animal. We have no way to know.
So, but
And
in terms of like planning for another, but in terms of how that becomes integrated over time, when
right, so
so
it
the
becomes
abuse
a
has
learned
ended,
response.
right? That's what I'm
Correct.
saying, it right? So it
Yeah.
becomes, the abuse has ended, I'm no longer in
Right.
threat, but some new event triggers me to say, like, for example, the mikvah, or a new healthy sexual relationship, or just a new regular relationship. And
Right.
there's something about that that says, I can't trust that I know that this person is safe. I can't trust that I know that this experience is safe, and my body is reactive in a way that is, kind of, that I don't know if what I'm experiencing is right, wrong, appropriate, not appropriate, a product of my abuse, a product of no abuse. Like, that's where I'm thinking the word distrust is being used.
Yeah, so I think
Okay.
it's a disconnect might even be a
Okay.
better might even be a
Okay.
bit more nuanced word than
Okay.
distrust between what I cognitively know, which I may know that this person is safe. I may know that this environment is safe, but that doesn't feel accurate in my body.
Okay.
And I think that that feeling of being unsettled in someone's body, I think that a lot of people live with this. I don't think that it's only specific to child sexual abuse survivors.
Agreed. Sure.
And I think it's much more acute in a survivor of extreme abusive trauma, where like the idea that they can even feel settled in their body feels like a scary prospect.
Mm. So if you come back to this idea of this, that there's this self-inspection, right? That we are to check our bodies, make sure there's nothing on our bodies. I didn't accidentally like write some letters on my hand, and I don't have ink somewhere, and my hair is clean and brushed. Like, tell me a little bit about the experience then for a sexual abuse survivor in that space. What happens to them when they're experiencing mikvah?
So I want to first give a disclaimer that if anyone is experiencing a dissociative response to this, please speak to somebody. Speak to a halachic authority. Speak to many mikvahs have mikvah directors now who are trained in mental health response and can help advocate for you with whoever you need to be able to improve your experience so that you don't have a dissociative response at the mikvah. I think that it's something that people are so afraid to ask for support around because our education is that this is private and this is something that you shouldn't talk to anybody about, but sometimes just talking to somebody can make it so much more approachable and so much more navigable to live through,
Yeah,
uh, and to not disrupt the whatever coping mechanisms people have been working on building for so long. But I think that for people who experience that disconnect, to be faced with like the preparation rooms, they're beautiful, but they have these really bright lights and really big mirrors, and there's no way to like control the lights in your own individual room. And there, like the space is one that is encouraging this inspection because it really is the goal of being able to immerse in the mikvah is that there should not be any barrier between the mikvah water and the person going underneath the mikvah water. And there's a lot of spiritual beauty in that. It's a spiritual rebirth. It's, you're re-entering the womb of creation and being born a new person. And there's a lot of really beautiful ideas that underlie the reasoning for that. And for someone who's experienced child sexual abuse and they don't feel settled in their body, for them to be faced with this experience of needing to be under these jarring lights and to check to make sure that there's no barriers on their body, that means being confronted with parts of the body that may have been really actively used as and objectified in the abuse situation. And needing to sometimes like touch those parts of the body, and sometimes and again, it's the person with their own body. There's no reason that anyone should ever touch someone else's body in this context, and especially not without asking, and especially not without being clothed and covered. Although it does happen, and the mikveh can also become a place of abuse. And that's why it's so important to continue to repeat that message over and over and over again. And so I think that that's what makes the experience so potentially re-traumatizing, and why it's so important to build in safeguards
right.
around how can I make this my own experience? If the mikvah lights are too jarring for me, can I do this step at home in a safer environment where I don't need to be unclothed in the preparation room with myself in those big mirrors? Can I cover the mirrors? Can I, like, and all of those things, there are possibilities for making accommodations.
Right. So we jumped right into the mikvah experience, and I want to broaden it now into I want to hear you describe the profile of a sexual abuse survivor. Let's start with a woman. And what are some of the characteristics that I know a lot of it you talked about as protective, but let's break it down. What presents as this person becomes an adult, either interpersonally with other friends, relationships, eventually sexual relationships? What is the profile, or the more classic profile of a sexual abuse survivor? And then
So
probably
I
I would say we have to differentiate between one who gets help and one that doesn't get help, I think. Right?
Yeah, yeah, I think so too. And I think I want to also be really clear that like one survivor's experience is one survivor's experience. And so yes, there are some common threads that we may see from one survivor to another. And I think that it's also definitely possible that the person that you may meet may be the exception to some of those common threads.
Absolutely.
So we know that, especially when abuse happens at a young developmental age, that a lot of the thought processes around the context of that abuse get solidified within the age that the abuse occurred. So for someone who experiences child sexual abuse at the ages between like 4 and 7, where a lot of bodily autonomy is being established developmentally and understanding the differences between males and females and understanding the differences, like what is privacy versus what is open, what is my space versus what is your space. So a lot of those things can be very muddled and confused. And those thought processes can be taken into the future and spill into other categories and other relationships. So there's the research shows that about 60% of people will become they'll have negative associations with sex and sexuality, and about 40% of people will have positive associations with sex and sexuality, sometimes to the point of hypersexuality or impulsive sexuality. And people who have negative associations, which is the majority of survivors, will have a lot of black and white thinking around what's good versus what's bad. And everything that fits into like a sexual or sometimes also a pleasure category will be put into that bad because the experience that gave someone else pleasure was harmful to this individual. And so they may have a lot of aversions to physical touch. They may be dissociative, like doe-eyed, wide-eyed. They may experience a lot of dissociation in life in general, a lot of fear around bodies in general, body dysmorphia, sometimes issues with food and eating, issues with sleep, and interpersonally they may have intensity around sexual experiences when in a relationship, and that intensity can be re-traumatizing or may not be re-traumatizing. Again, I think very contextual depending on the level of help that they get. I think one experience that you and I have had with some of the survivors that we've supported is that once they reach the age of adulthood and they start to have children, that sometimes the issues that they believe had resolved at a younger age or at a younger developmental stage for themselves will crop up again once their kids reach the age where they experience the abuse.
Yeah.
And
Yeah,
yeah.
I distinctly remember having a conversation with a male rabbi, actually, a teacher in one of the schools in one of the communities in which I was teaching. And he said to me, I'm really okay. I'm really okay. But like, I really thought I was okay. And then recently, I've really been having a hard time. Like, I've a lot more memories that are coming up, and I'm just like, I'm not doing so great. Why now? And I said to him, like, it was my instinct to say to him, like, how old were you when your abuse started? And he said, I was 5. I said, how old is your son? And he said, and all of a sudden he was like, oh, my son just turned 5. And I think you begin to see yourself at that age and you realize how little they were and how little he was. And to see himself as an adult into the eyes of, watching the eyes of his 5-year-old child developing and looking at it through adult eyes, you realize, just how bad that was for him and how much happened to him at that time. I remember Rabbi Tippel spoke similarly about when his children became that age, how powerful that was for him to notice. So, yeah. What happens in relationships? Let's talk a little bit about that into the relationships. I know when I've spoken to survivors, so much of it is about trust, not only trusting their body, but also trusting the other person. How can I know that this person really won't hurt me in the way that this previous person that I trusted hurt me?
Right. I think it's such a complicated question when you add in a systemic lens to it also. What education am I bringing into this relationship about sex and sexuality? How present was I able to be when I was receiving that education, especially if I didn't disclose to whoever was teaching me that I am a survivor, right? Like how when we add in the systemic question of like, what is my individual relationship with my own sexuality? And then how does it present in relationship with somebody else? I think that it becomes a much more complex narrative. And I don't think that it's possible to really separate out to create a profile of one individual experience. I do think that for most survivors, their whatever messaging they have internalized about sex and sexuality is through this lens of what had happened to them when they were children. And so, for someone who is in that 60% of negative sexual experiences, that means that anything that belongs to the category of sex equals bad. I am bad if I engage in anything sexual. I am bad if I utilize sex to elicit a response from somebody else, or if they're using sex to elicit a response from me. Now, that think about the language in that, right? Like what is a sexual relationship? You are engaging in a sexual activity to elicit a response from somebody that you are in a sexual relationship with. And under the right circumstances, it's beautiful and wonderful and safe and can really enhance and create meaning in a relationship. And for the abuse survivor, it can be completely terrifying because if sex equals power, then I am using sex in a cycle of power with somebody that I have positive romantic feelings about. And the word confusing is the word that we always talk about as the most common word that is used to explain what an abuse survivor's experience is like. And I think that that like snapshot is an incredibly confusing snapshot to be able
Mhm.
to navigate.
Yeah.
And so in the under the best circumstances with the right support, communication and healing is always possible. It requires the survivor to have the autonomy and the agency to say no at any point in any sexual experience under any circumstances, and for the supportive person in the relationship to have the awareness that it's not about the relationship and it's not about the sexual relationship. It's about this individual's experience of this specific moment. And those things can change from minute to minute. With support, there's a lot of safeguards that can be put into place. Environmental safeguards, specifically like what room in the house are you in? Or, what is the environment like? Is it dark or are there lights present? Are there sensory tools that can be used to help ground you in this moment, in this time, so that you're not being like cast back to your childhood?
Hmm.
Are there specific sexual experiences that need to be just left off the table and not ever pursued by the couple?
Right.
But all of that requires a very extreme baseline of trust to be able to talk about and to share, and to say, like, this reminds me of what happened to me when I was a kid, and therefore I'm never going to be okay with that.
It's so powerful because I think when we have these conversations, we talk about this from like the perspective of that with the hope of or the expectation of that people can have really good communication skills and be able to have these conversations. And I think in back to now, okay, let's get real about how many people have we don't have the usually we don't have this very heavily evolved or well developed communication capacity and some better than others, but I think so much of the work we know, what I've learned actually about sex therapy in general is it's really all about communication. And like 99% of what we're doing is helping people communicate about what's working and what's not working, about their relationships that then kind of is presenting itself in the sexual space. But I think that when we think about like, if I have really good communication, I can convey what's good and what's bad or what's working or what's not working for me. And then I got to get real to say, like, how many people really have the skills to say, I like this, I don't like this, I'm comfortable with this, or this reminds me of, or I'm not comfortable with this. Like, we're therapists, we're good at talking, right? And my kids get like, oh, mom, you're being so therapist-y, right? Like, we get there. But it doesn't mean that we are excellent or outstanding communicators all the time. We will individually experience this as well, right? So I think about like how critical the need for a really evolved communication to be the at the core of the relationship that's supposed to be healthy and a good, healthy new relationship, not between abuser and victim. And for many people, I think it's inaccessible.
Well,
Like,
and
or it's
if
going
we
to take
go
a lot
back
of skill building, right?
and and healing, because if we
Yeah.
go back to the go-to coping mechanism in the child sexual abuse experience, which is freeze or fawn, what is the first faculty that is lost when someone is experiencing a freeze response or a fawn response? It is the ability to communicate, and especially to communicate verbally. And so
Yeah.
because that becomes a learned response, a lot of survivors will re-experience the freeze response in a sexual experience, and their partners will have no idea. They won't know. Now, I've most acutely seen this with a client who was told by her husband that she was passing out during sex, that she was
Hmm.
falling asleep during sex, and he was offended. He didn't know that it was a trauma response.
Right.
Um, and when the partner doesn't know because they don't have the ability to disclose, then you can see how that can perpetuate
Right.
into a lot of conflict in a relationship that is it's a perpetuation of the same trauma that the person experienced when they were a child.
Now, when we're talking about these, we went right into the how the child of sexual abuse shows up in adult sexual life, right? Adult sexual spaces, even in a loving and trusted and cognitively safe space. Talk to me though about what your experience has been. What are some of the features? I'm curious on this one. Really, what are the features of some of the people that you know are survivors of sexual abuse that kind of relationally that shows up in a non-sexual space when people are survivors of sexual abuse? What have you noticed?
I think that there's a hypervigilance that exists for a survivor. And I think that this is something that's true for any survivor of any trauma. It's not only unique to a child sexual abuse experience, but I think that that hypervigilance means that they're always on guard. And so whenever there's any sort of relational conflict, the same coping mechanisms that kept them safe during the sexual abuse experience will show up. And so they may be self-dismissive. They may have a freeze response if they get into a normal conflict with a partner. We also know that abuse patterns tend to repeat themselves. And so sometimes survivors will end up in relationships where there are experiences within their current relationships that are reflective of the abuse experience that they had when they were children. And so there can be a lot of extrication that needs to happen, and it can feel very murky and confusing. I think the idea of emotional safety for a lot of survivors feels unsafe. The idea that they can let that guard down and that they can reduce some of that hypervigilance. And for many, they may not know how, depending on the level of support and how the response happened, if it happened at all when they were children. We know that that is the biggest preventative factor to continuation of abuse and continuation of trauma is if the adults in that child's life responded appropriately and quickly and got them to a place of safety.
Yeah.
Um, and I think that that hypervigilance is probably the biggest barrier to building trusting and vulnerable relationships with others. Because if vulnerability is unsafe, then how can you have a vulnerable relationship with somebody else?
hmm hmm Let's talk about what is gonna look like in parenting because when you are and I'm acknowledging that we're really primarily focusing on women at this time, and I think it's okay for this conversation, but I think we can absolutely extrapolate on men as well. But when we're talking about the parenting space, you begin with that term of hypervigilance, right? That at any moment there is a threat in the environment that could harm my children. And so when we begin to experience what it means to be protecting a new child, right, a young child or a toddler or someone going out into the world for the first time to preschool or daycare or school in general, it can feel terrifying that I cannot be there to protect my child. What have you noticed in the people that you've worked with?
So I've definitely noticed the hypervigilance, and I've also noticed that hypervigilance doesn't always show up the way we expect it to. So hypervigilance may be in thought, it may be in fear, it may be in anxiety, but it's not, and it's internalized by the survivor. It may not show up in the environment. So you might have a very hypervigilant parent who is very detached from their child. They may not be hovering over their child, watching their every move. They may be too afraid to do the drop off and pick up at daycare because the idea of being confronted with another caregiver feels like a personal threat to their role as caregiver in this child's life. The hypervigilance shows up in other ways, definitely in PMADs, in perinatal mood disorders, um, postpartum OCD, a lot of intrusive thoughts around fears of other people coming in and harming their child sexually, or fears that they may harm their child sexually, which are very, very common fears for non-survivors and even more
Yeah.
so for survivors of child
I,
sexual
I
abuse.
want to acknowledge that because I think that was a really fascinating data point that I learned years ago that one of the very common, unfortunately difficult, common intrusive thoughts that people may have with postpartum OCD specifically is the threat of molesting their own child, right? Of inappropriately touching their child. And what that looks like is I can't change my baby's diaper because what if I inappropriately touch my child? But what was interesting is that that's not necessarily correlated to child sexual abuse trauma. It can show up for people who have no child sexual abuse history. So don't be confused if those of you who are therapists listening, like, don't be confused with this idea of like, oh, they must have had child sexual abuse if they have these intrusive thoughts. The answer is they don't. But it's not necessarily. But it's that idea of like, what would be the worst thing that could happen to my child? And then there feels like there's risk everywhere of those things happening. Yeah,
Right. And so the hypervigilance for a survivor may extend to like not allowing anyone to hold the baby, may extend to not allowing anyone. And again, people who are not survivors also have sometimes these presentations, especially with postpartum OCD. And so if you're a mom listening to this, I don't want you to think like, oh, do I have some sort of deep-seated repressed memory of child sexual abuse also? Because you may need support around an OCD concern.
sure.
That may have nothing to do with some sort of suppressed memory or not, repressed memory that you may have. But knowing that the hypervigilance prevents the vulnerability, I think that help seeking for survivors around some of these things can feel much more scary because when you have a mom who has some of these intrusive thoughts, the intrusive thoughts feel foreign. They feel like they're coming from outside. They feel like this doesn't belong to me, right? We call it ego dystonic. It's not something that I feel like is true, but I'm very disturbed by it and I don't want to hold it. And so I'm hopefully, if I have enough awareness and my providers are on top of all of my screenings enough, and I have friends that I talk about the transition to parenting with, then I can find out from other people like, oh, I also had intrusive thoughts when I had a baby, and there's help out there for me, right? Like it doesn't feel as scary to go get help. But when I'm sitting with this abuse experience and trauma, these thoughts may not feel foreign because I know that these horrible things that I'm thinking about could actually happen because they happened to me. And therefore, I'm the only responsible party for this individual. I'm the only person who can keep this child safe. And that amount of responsibility is really a lot for somebody to hold. And the idea of getting help around it means I don't only have to face my intrusive thoughts, but I also have to face what is in this locked Pandora's box that I have been so afraid to open for however many years I've been a survivor. And that might feel like being on the edge of a cliff. Like that might feel like being on the edge of an abyss. And it really, really requires getting appropriate help from the right professional. It's not going to somebody who, may have a few years of graduate experience and is working in a clinic or, this means going to a trained trauma professional who can help you navigate how these experiences turned into these intrusive thoughts.
Yeah. And potentially opening that box. But I think the other piece of this is that there's a part of this that feels very necessary, right? Like when we talk about, I was just doing some supervision yesterday and we were talking about somebody who, uh, she was working in a case where there was a child sexual abuse had just come forward and, the brother admitted it and the sister, acknowledged it. And there was risk that there were other young children involved. And we were talking about like the responsibility of the parent. And it's really hard for me to sit here and say, no, they didn't, they were doing the best they could. There was a lot of children in the home and there was a lack of supervision. And I do think that there is some part of this that is the responsibility of adults to keep children safe. It's not a child's responsibility to keep themselves safe. And it is the parent's responsibility. And abuse happens when someone's not looking, right? Most of the time. And this is one of those situations that when we think about that, like there is some parental responsibility. So you can understand where a survivor, child abuse survivor feels, well, it is my responsibility to be hypervigilant, very aware, not let my kids out of my sight, right? You and I both have had conversations with women who said, I'm not letting my kids ever go on a sleepover, ever have a play date, ever go to somebody else's house, because that I know in my house they're safe. I mean, and yet how do we straddling those two worlds of wanting to give our children freedom and autonomy and independence, but really knowing there is this threat out there, right? Especially for you and I as the teachers of abuse prevention, it's terrifying to know what is out there and where abuse happens. I think the one thing that I personally find comforting in terms of, just sharing this with you and all of our listeners is like, I feel comforting to actually notice that there really is actually a pattern, that there is very consistent ways to keep our children safe. Are there outliers? There are always Larry Nassars out there. There are outliers. But in general, if we follow the safety rules of abuse prevention in our homes, schools, and community spaces, our kids will be safer. And never 100%, but it is a predictable pattern. Abusers really actually are quite predictable. So, that provides me a level of comfort and support. But for a parent who is a survivor of child abuse, like it does not that is not that does not provide them any kind of comfort, right? That's it just makes it all the more terrifying that there are abusers that continue to be outed and arrested, and also could be in our neighbors and neighborhoods. And
Right.
so that feeling of like I want to be a good mom, good moms protect their kids. Good moms are always on high alert for danger and safety. And that's where I think it gets really messy in parenting.
Right. Especially, I think when the abuse experience was that it was someone who was supposed to be a safe adult in this person's life,
Sure. Which
or
we know is a pretty high percentage of the
right.
people who are abusing small children, right?
Right, right. Or a sibling, and the parents have, an allegiance to all of their children.
Yeah.
And so keeping one child safe will come at the expense of another child. And yes, it's a child who clearly needs treatment for whatever it is that they're experiencing, and not pursuing that treatment will be way more harmful in the long run than pretending that the abuse isn't happening under their roof. But it's so murky and so messy. And I think that anger is a necessary part of the healing process. I think that survivors need to feel angry at their parents for not keeping them safe. I think that survivors need to feel anger at those adults that should have seen something and didn't, or did see something worse and didn't say anything and didn't ask the questions and didn't raise the alarm bells.
Yeah.
Um, and so I think that with any trauma experience, there's going to be this level of hypervigilance that it is developed, and it's necessary for survival. Again, going back to the beginning. And I think that there can be the development of flexible thinking and saying, like, yes, my experience was real and what happened to me was real, and it doesn't mean that it's going to happen again.
Right.
And,
Right.
I can see my experience as an isolated trauma or a prolonged trauma, and I can do the best that I can to keep my kids safe. But we also know that sometimes survivors they'll unintentionally abuse their kids by showing them scary videos, or showing them,
Mm,
sharing with them not age appropriate stories, because they want their kids to understand the risks. But that's not necessary. That's a perpetuation of a different kind of abuse,
mm.
um,
Interesting.
like vicarious trauma, and putting the survival responsibility on a child when they don't own it because that's not their experience.
Exactly. I mean, and it also needs to be the job of the parent to keep them safe. Again, not the child's responsibility to do it for themselves.
Correct.
I think that I want to come back to that word confusion because I think that is one of the things that I actually adjusted in the curriculum that we've been using for the last number of years, in that the original curriculum was about something makes me feel uncomfortable, and, no run tell, or you should say no.
Uh-oh feeling.
Right, exactly. Something just makes me feel uncomfortable. And yet, I think every survivor I have spoken to have said, well, there were parts of it that were uncomfortable, but there were parts of it that I liked, right? There were parts of it. I remember a survivor said to me, a woman that I actually use her voice in some of the training. She has never told anybody else about her abuse, other than a therapist, and she's done a lot of work around it. And she said to me, like, she said in the conversation with me, she said, look, there was a part that I did not like, and it was a brother. And she said, but he also gave me candy. And, it felt I wanted the candy. I was 7, 8, 10 years old, and I wanted candy. And every time he touched me, I got candy. And so in her mind, that idea of something makes me feel uncomfortable was not a cut and dry, clear, line. And so we've moved over to when something feels confusing. And what I think is so powerful is that our teenagers can understand that so much more, right? They understand that this concept of like relationships in general can be confusing, and how we discuss those relationships from the perspective of confusion is more relevant to them. It resonates with them more deeply. And when we can actually discuss cases of abuse, they can talk about that confusion actually more openly. It's pretty interesting to see them discuss like more very we just did a training, and we talked about like, what have you heard in the news this year? And the kids brought up, I think, I don't even know what he's called now, but it was P. Diddy in my days, right? I think he's just called Diddy now. And the abuse case that came out. And it was
Yeah.
fabulous to hear these teenage boys, at this point, I think these were eighth graders, talking about like, but why did she go back? Or why did the girl stay? Or what was in it for them? Or where were their moms? And like, they were able to see that there's a lot of confusion around these, especially the high profile experiences. Is there anything else I'm like, I'm hesitating on asking you this question because I want to be sensitive to the question itself, but I am wondering because I know what I've noticed in terms of personality traits that you will see in when people are survivors of abuse. Often there's some significant disruption in personality and their behaviors towards others that we would even consider calling a personality disorder. It's very often we, differences of opinion on I think we're all in agreement that something like borderline personality disorder tends to be really a trauma. It's really like what happened to you that this became the way that you interact with others. And I think borderline by definition is a little bit, it's just, if for those of you who are not familiar with it, it's something that is considered a formal personality disorder. A lot of it is like the term an energy vampire, somebody who kind of like can suck you dry, right? They want a lot from you, a lot, and you always are betraying them no matter how good you are to them, especially as therapists. Is this something that you want to address? Is there a trend or a thread that you're willing to go there with me on? Or is it something that feels like, oh, it's disrespectful to the survivors?
Well, I think that the whole profile of like someone who is borderline is disrespectful to survivors in general, right? I think that like, the DSM was not created from a trauma-informed lens by any stretch of the imagination. It was to be able to slap a CPT code onto a billing statement, and to be able to be able to
Get
chart
paid.
behavior and get paid by
Yep.
insurance companies, right? But I think that a lot of the traits that we see in the profile of a survivor's personality go back to this black and white thinking around good and bad and the good and bad. And I think from a developmental lens, kids experience the world in binaries. They experience the world in good and bad, black and white. And being able to introduce nuance that it's possible for people to be experiencing more than one thing at the same time is part of the process of healing, which is what makes dialectical behavioral therapy so powerful for not only people who have borderline personality disorder, but also for people who are intense trauma survivors. Because
Absolutely.
the idea that experiences can exist in outside of a binary, and I could have had this traumatic experience that there were elements of that I liked, is even a very developmentally advanced and nuanced statement for a survivor to be able to make, especially if they don't feel shame related to that element of, I liked the candy. I liked what they liked was not the part that perpetuated the harm, although the candy was used to perpetuate the harm and to manipulate, right? And so I think that a lot of that comes out in black and white thinking around people. Like people are either all good or all bad. And that creates a lot of conflict in interpersonal relationships. It creates a lot of conflict in marital relationships. It creates a lot of conflict in friendships. It creates a lot of distrust. Sometimes it's referred to as like this dynamic of like, I hate you. I can't stand you. I want to get away from you, but don't leave me. I really need you. You keep me safe. So there's this binary of dependency and codependency and also rejection. And it's usually very emotionally intense. There's a lot of intense emotions, or emotionally flat, where there's no emotions, but like they're all hovering underneath the surface. And a lot of therapeutic skills are needed to be built in order to be able to pull those out and
Yeah.
make sense of them.
What
And
y-
yeah.
Go ahead. Go ahead. Go just finish what you're
I was
saying.
just gonna say, like, you can't tackle it all at once. Sometimes,
Yeah.
healing has to happen in stages, right? Like, no one gets from being a child survivor to being a completely integrated adult without going through a lot of different iterations of healing at different developmental stages and allowing that survival experience to develop
Yeah. Yeah.
when they weren't able to develop in that moment, in that formative moment.
And I think about that also when I think the idea of like as you are confronted with a new life experience and a developmental life experience,
Right.
like becoming a parent, you will be confronted with new thoughts, new feelings, and new experiences. And I think that maybe I could remind somebody who is a child abuse survivor that just because you did therapy when you were younger and you did beautifully and you've grown and maybe even you would use the term healed, it is normal for new experiences to not necessarily reopen the wounds, but to require new attention that you will then be able to grow more, right? Regular parenting requires growth. That's just standard, right? We are growing in all different directions all the time. Parenting a 5-year-old is different than parenting a 15-year-old, which is very different than parenting a 25-year-old. And yes, you will need to parent your 25-year-olds in their own way. So some of it is a normal experience of learning how to parent differently. And then perhaps if you are a survivor, that you will also need to reorient your history and your healing to the circumstances that are occurring to you now at this point in your life. In wrapping up our conversation, I can't believe how quickly that went. Can you just offer the audience a little bit of, I'd love for you to talk about one or two misconceptions about child sexual abuse or survivorship. What are some things that you think of?
So I think one of the biggest misconceptions is that the abuse stops when the physical abuse stops.
Mm.
And the reason that I think it's a misconception is I think that for most survivors, abuse is not happening by a stranger. Like stranger danger is, that would be the misconception, right? Like stranger danger is a misconception. When I was growing up, it was don't talk to strangers. But really, the strangers are not the people that we need to be worried about as showing up. It's the Larry Nassers, it's the beloved school teachers, it's the communal figures, the youth group leaders,
It's
and
the brothers and sisters. I think
brothers
we
and
have
sisters.
to say that.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's the brothers and sisters. It's the best friends, older brothers and sisters.
Yes.
And so I think that the reason the abuse doesn't stop is because for many adult survivors who experience childhood sexual abuse, they have to interact with their abusers on some level. And that experience creates this lack of safety in a way that is in some places like really non-navigable, like really, really difficult to navigate. Thinking about someone I know who was at a family wedding and her child was speaking with her abuser
Wow.
and elicited a physiological response in her that was like a lion. Like she like couldn't get out of there fast enough. And who could blame her?
No.
Um, and I think so that would be one misconception. And the other misconception I think you actually captured really beautifully, which is that like once you're healed, you're healed. I don't think that healing is ever linear for anybody who experienced any complex trauma, and especially for an abuse survivor. Our relationships with our own bodies are nonlinear. Our relationships with our own experiences of our own sexuality are nonlinear. And they change as developmental changes happen throughout the lifespan and as milestones happen throughout the lifespan. And so just because you got help when you were a kid, if you got help, if you were lucky enough to get help when you were a kid, doesn't mean that as you continue to grow and go through whatever milestones and developmental milestones you're experiencing, that things won't creep up and that thoughts won't creep up and that some of that binary thinking won't creep up, and it's okay to get help, and it's okay to say I need some support around this, even
Yeah.
if it just feels uncomfortable to live with, right? Like you may be cognitively there, but your physiological space may not be there, and it's okay to just get help because you're uncomfortable in where you are.
And I think that I would like to conclude also with this idea of like, and be kind to yourself about needing the help, right? I
Yeah.
think some people see needing help as therefore there is something wrong with me. No, something happened to you. And it is okay to be self-compassionate and to say, I deserve this. Like it is okay for me to get the support that I need because I'm worth it. And so I think that would be like a reminder of the kind voice that you can give to yourself in needing help over the lifespan. Because I think a lot of people want to say, I just want to be done with it. Like, I don't want this to like rule my life. And it doesn't have to rule your life, but it is likely that it will be part of your life in the future. How and when and where is going to be each individual experience. I remember having somebody tell me that she had severe OCD after a birth, and then she had a grandchild 30, 20 years later, 20, 25 years later. And all of a sudden her OCD exploded again, where it had been completely dormant for a long time. And it was her daughter's postpartum that sparked her OCD. And so new experiences, new processes, be kind to yourself in that experience. So Carly, thank you. Thank you for this conversation. I know we will have more. I really appreciate your taking the time.
It's my pleasure. Thank you so much for having me, and I look forward to hearing what your listeners think about this
Abs-
episode. Yeah.
Absolutely.